I couldn't even keep up with one of those piles. So where do I get the time? I don't eat, I don't sleep, I don't spend time with friends, I don't work out, I don't do anything that's really good for me, in terms of self-care. And I just live in the library and I'm there for like weeks and weeks, pulling all these all-nighters and skipping meals. And, it's not very sustainable. And I end up passing out one night. And I remember I fell down a flight of stairs in the library. I hit my head again. And I woke up 2 days later in the hospital. And at this point, I've lost all this weight because I wasn't eating and I was down to 117 pounds. I woke up hooked up to all these IVs and, I was malnourished, dehydrated, and I thought there has to be a better way. And it was the darkest time in my life. I've never experienced so much depression, so much despair. And I thought there has to be a better way. And when I had that thought, the nurse came in with a mug of tea, and on it was a picture of Albert Einstein. Now, it's so interesting because that was my book report, right? And there was these words on the mug of tea that there was a quote that we've all heard before in some different form, in some iteration. It said, "The same level of thinking that's created your problem won't solve your problem. The same level of thinking that's created the problem won't solve it." And I was thinking, what's my problem? I asked going back to the power of questions, and thought, wow, I'm a really slow learner. And I was like, well, how do I think differently about this problem? Well, so maybe I could learn how to learn faster, right? Maybe I could learn how to learn. And when I had that new idea, I was like, okay, well, where do I learn how to learn? And I was like, well, where do I learn anything in school? So I asked the nurse to bring me a course bulletin with the courses for next semester. And when I get it, I look through all the pages and I look at all these different classes that I could take. And all the classes were classes on what to learn, important subjects like math, history, science, Spanish, but there were zero classes on how to learn. For example, how to think, how to solve problems, how to focus and concentrate, how to listen better, how to read faster, how to remember more. I always thought it should have been the fourth R in school. You have reading, writing, arithmetic, but what about retention? What about recall? What about remembering, right? Socrates says learning is remembering, because why study if you can't recall this information, right? And so I put my studies aside in school and I start focusing on this thing called meta learning. I wanted to solve this riddle, this puzzle, if you will, that, I wanted to solve this puzzle thing, like, how does my brain work so I could work my brain? How does my memory work so I could work my memory? And I started studying adult learning theory. I started studying multiple intelligence theory. I started studying speed reading and mnemonics and all these different things, a little about brain science. And after about 60 days of intensive study, a light switch went on. And for the first time in my life, I started to understand things. For the first time in my life, I started to have better focus. For the first time in my life, I started to retain information from my textbooks. And my grades went up, but not only my grades, but it's just as my grades improved, my life really improved. And that's when I realized that it's possible to work smarter and not just harder. And what put me on this path is I actually got really angry. I got really upset that these skills and these abilities, what I thought was fixed, what like your IQ or your intelligence wasn't. And I was thinking, why wasn't this taught to me in school? Simple techniques or tools, resources on how I could just level up my learning and level up my life. And so I started to be more of an evangelist. I started to help my friends. I started to tutor. And one of my very first students, she was a freshman in college. She read, get this, Katie, she read 30 books in 30 days. I mean, can you imagine like going online and picking up 30 books on anything, Mandarin and marketing, music, martial art, whatever. And she read it, not skimmed it, but really retained it and was applying it. And I wanted to find out not how, because I know how she did it. I wanted to know, going back to motivation, I wanted to know the power of why. And I found out that by asking her that her mother was dying of terminal cancer, doctors gave her only 2 months to live. So the books she was reading were books on health and wellness, alternative medicine, energy, a lot of the things that you could blog about, because she was determined to save her mom's life. And I found out I get a call from her 6 months later, and she's crying and crying and crying. And I find out they're tears of joy that her mother not only survived, but is really getting better. Doctors don't know how, they don't know why. They called it a miracle, but her mother attributed 100% to the great advice she got from her daughter, who learned it from all these books. And that's in that moment, I realized that if knowledge is power, learning is our superpower. That if knowledge is power, learning is our superpower. And it's a superpower available for all of us, for our children, for our teams. And I think it's so important that people learn how to learn. So I've dedicated the past quarter of a century and more just to help people build better, brighter brains with easy tools, easy techniques that we should have learned back in school. And my mission really is no brain left behind.
I love so much of what you just said. And it reminds me too of my own childhood. And it actually triggered some pain points for me in a good way, in that I think so often, and this is part of life, so often those struggles end up becoming, like you said, our superpower, because you said you were the boy with the broken brain and I was the girl with the broken body. So I had strep throat pretty much constantly. The first 5 years of my life, I had dozens of rounds of antibiotics, eventually had surgery that took out my tonsils and my adenoids and got tubes. And I was in somewhat good health after that, other than that I had had so many rounds of antibiotics, which now I can look back and see the early roots of autoimmune disease. And I had that mindset for so long that my brain or my body was broken and it didn't work right. And it wasn't ever going to do what it was supposed to do. And that's something that even as an adult, I've had to really consciously learn to let go of. And it really came up for me, in becoming a mother and during pregnancy. And even in my first delivery with my first son, fighting that mindset that my body was broken and it wasn't going to do it right. And I wasn't going to be able to have a baby, and just how deeply those childhood experiences can affect us for our whole life. But I also love that, and I know this is a core tenet for you and a core part of your life, that you really equate success and superpowers, like you said, not to money or achievement, but to helping others and changing the world. And I think that's why I was so drawn to your approach and why I love the work that you do. And so I'd love to go a little deeper on the concepts you talked about, because I know there's a lot of parents listening. And I know that many of them have heard from teachers or from school professionals that their kids are maybe not good learners in certain ways, or that they don't have enough focus, or they're not good at certain subjects. And I feel like the school system in general, it tends to grade our deficiencies, not what we're good at. They count off points for mistakes, but you don't get points for being creative or for thinking outside the box, or for having a unique genius that maybe doesn't show up on a test. So I would love to hear you speak to that a little bit, to these parents who think that maybe their kids don't quite have what it takes, or maybe their child is like you were as a kid, and how they can approach that differently, so that, because as parents, none of us want to pass on obviously anything negative to our kids. And I'd love to hear your take on that from having seen that as a child yourself.
Absolutely. And I honor what you were saying, because it's so interesting that through your struggles, you've gained so much strength and be able to share that, again, when we're talking about superpowers and superheroes with so many millions of people. And so I would say that for the parents listening, or anyone who has a relationship with a child, that there's a few ideas that I think we understand as common sense, but how do we put it into common practice? So I would say, for example, when we're talking about intelligence, I don't believe that, like you, I believe that intelligence and potential is not fixed, that it's fluid. One of my favorite books is Mindset, all about, by Carol Dweck, which I know you're familiar with, and that there's a difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And one of the disservices we do sometimes with children is we reward an identity around them being, gifted or somehow a genius. But what really we need to be reinforcing is their work ethic, right? They're developing their grit, and, believing that having to work hard. Sometimes when people have a fixed mindset, they're concerned more about looking smart, like children looking smart, and they regard less for learning. And it's more that something they either have or they don't have. And so negative views, towards effort or believing they have to work hard at something was a sign of more lower status or lower ability. And the thought that a person with talent or intelligence did not need to work as hard. And we know that it's not true, that we should be rewarding people for children and others, in our care, whether we're leading them in a business or any otherwise. Proper praise is how do we transmit that growth mindset to children. And we know that one way is really reinforcing and telling stories around achievements that came from hard work. That somebody is not just a genius at music or a genius at math, but it's these people, fell in love with these subjects and they practiced every single day. That it's possible that you can actually grow your brain, that IQ, standardized tests. You think about school, like even SATs. I remember taking the SATs and it was like verbal and mathematical. But we know through all the research that there's not just two forms of intelligence, and it's not only is it not fixed, that it's not the way we're rating it with individuals. It's not fine, meaning it's not narrow, but it's far reaching. And so it's, for example, it's somebody could hit great verbal and math, but if they don't do well on those tests, they feel like they don't have something to offer or they're not smart. But what about people who have great visual spatial intelligence, right? And you're talking about like the graphic artists and the architects. What about people who have children who have great interpersonal skills, meaning that they're great with people? I mean, that's such an important, that EQ, if you will, is so important in today's society. Well, maybe it's not interpersonal self to others, maybe self to self, like intrapersonal intelligence, people who really understand human psychology. What about people who are great with music, musical intelligence? You have all the entertainers and the singers, the composers. What about kinesthetic intelligence? People who have children who are great, or adults great with their body. You have your athletes, you have your dancers, in so many different forms of these intelligence. But I find, and Howard Gardner is really credited out of Harvard University as really expanding this multiple intelligence theory. And so I would say that talking to parents, that intelligence is not fixed, it's fluid, it could grow, and you want to reinforce that with your children, hard work. Also that intelligence is not just fixed, but it's also not fixed, and it's also not fine or narrow, it's far reaching. And that there's a huge spectrum of genius, if you will, that it's not how smart somebody is, not how smart you are. It's not how smart your children are, but it's another question. It's not how smart they are. It's how are they smart? And so we all have this genius that we want to, with children, you give them a broad experience base, and then you can see where their interests go naturally, and then you help them to be able to develop them. And the third thing I would say, besides intelligence is not fixed, and that it's also, second thing, that is far reaching, I would say a third thing is that there's no such thing as a good or bad student. There's no such thing as a good or bad student any more than there is such thing as a good or bad memory. There's just a trained student and an untrained student. And just like with a memory, there's no such thing as a good or bad memory. There's just a trained memory and an untrained memory. And what I would say is something practical when you're working with yourself or your team or your family is to take nouns and turn them into verbs. What do I mean by that? I often hear people on social media, they'll message me and saying, Jim, I don't have a good memory, or my children don't have focus, or I don't have motivation, or my child doesn't have creativity. These aren't things you have like nouns. You don't have focus, you do focus. You don't have concentration, you do concentration. You don't have energy, you do energy. You don't have creativity, you do creativity. Just like you don't have a memory, you actually do a memory. And the benefit of turning into a verb is it becomes an action and it becomes a process. And so in our podcast, for instance, every week we give tips on how to remember names, how to read faster, how to be an effective listener, how to take notes. It's always focusing on the how, because it becomes like a recipe. Like if you wanted to bake a cake, gluten-free, sugar-free, organic, natural cake, there's steps, and you have to do those steps in orders. Well, there's steps on how to learn a language, how to read a textbook, how to change your habits. But these things are often, people feel like they have habits, or they have intelligence. But I feel like that when we make it active, it's something that we could act on, and we